Video lesson 3.7, Russian Revolution. So before we dive in to the Russian Revolution itself and kind of the outcomes of it, I kind of want us to think about a few different things. We're going to back up, we're going to dive into all this background information. So it's going to get kind of jumbled, but just stay with me, take a pause if you need to, go back, reflect, whatever. So imagine we are in 1900 in Russia. This is the palace where the leader of Russia, the Tsar, and the Tsarina, his wife and his family, the royal family, live. So it is a palace such as this. This is actually pictures from my trip to St. Petersburg, which I took a few years ago. But this is actually their second home, their summer palace, where they spend the summers out in the country. And as you can see, it is quite large, quite detailed, very extravagant, and done in the latest styles, of course. And all of these little parts here, those are made out of gold. So you can't really see it shining because it was kind of a cloudy day when we went, but the gates, those are all gilded or painted with gold. These are all stables for their guards. You can see the intricate carvings here in this palace. All of this is actual gold. So you can see the luxury that these people live in, the extravagance and the wealth that they very publicly flaunted. Now, I went in as a museum, and this is how they live. Not everybody would be able to go in back a century ago, but just so you can see the crazy enormous, in hundreds and hundreds of rooms, they were all this detailed, all this gilded. This is silk wallpaper, and they have porcelain tiles surrounding their fireplaces. It is beautiful. It is extravagant. They would wear these luxurious outfits costing a fortune, what most people could never even dream of affording, because Russia at this time period is still mostly farmland. So this is in St. Petersburg, in the capital. This is their main palace, which is now a famous art museum. And basically it's right on the water there in St. Petersburg. And most people in Russia at this time, they didn't really have industry or factories workers. They had some, but Russia is a massive country. So most of the people, millions and millions and millions of them, were peasants. So they were still living under this feudal system where regional lords had power over those different tracts of land. This is again the gardens, a hand-dug lake, and a canal so that they could reach this, but all of this is marble and gold. Very luxurious. Now, on the flip side of that, we fast forward to World War I. These green columns for each country listed represent how many troops were mobilized. That means how many troops were actually fighting in the war. So you can see out of all the countries fighting in World War I, Russia had the most. And second by Germany, and then France, Austria, Hungary, Great Britain, the main countries we've been talking about so far. So the other thing that you might notice is that this gray column is the number wounded, and the red column is the number dead. So in terms of wounded and dead, which makes up the number of casualties, they are a very, very, very close second number of dead here listed here. So almost 2 million of their troops died in World War I, and remember, they left the war early. So they left the war early, mostly because of this Russian Revolution that we're about to talk about, but the reason that started is partly because they were doing so poorly and losing so many soldiers to the war. All right, so let's talk about the Tsar. So Russia is ruled by a Tsar. Well, sometimes you see it spelled T-S-A-R, and his name was Nicholas II, and he was part of the Romanov dynasty. So his parents were Romanovs, his grandparents were Romanovs, etc., etc. They had ruled Russia for hundreds of years, and he himself reigned from 1894 to 1917. And this is his beautiful family. If you're familiar with the movie Anastasia, Anastasia is Tsar Nicholas II's daughter. So her two sisters and her brother, those were Nicholas's children with his wife Alexandra. So Russia also had a legislative body called the Duma. And so remember, this is the body that makes the laws. So very similar to Britain in how Britain has a parliament and how Britain has a royal family. Similar to that kind of setup. The people of Russia at this time, though, were not content. So Russia had suffered great military losses already to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in 1894, which happened to be the same year that Tsar Nicholas II takes power after his father, Tsar Nicholas I. So, in this context, they had already suffered tremendous losses to Japan, and now they're wanting to enter another war, and they're not too pleased about this because they're already economically hurting, still damaged from the war, etc. So that's our context on the Royals, the Romanov side of things. Now we have this group called the Bolsheviks still forming in the years before World War I, so kind of in this 1900s era. So the leader of this group, known as the Bolsheviks, was Vladimir Lenin, and that's the guy pictured here. And their goal was to overthrow the Tsar. So if the Tsar was overthrown, the industrial workers could rise up to govern Russia. So Lenin wanted to establish a communist government. So now we have two sides. We have the Romanovs, who are in power, living very lavishly. We have a war about to break out in the rest of Europe that Russia might get involved in to support Serbia. And then we have this kind of minority group of the Bolsheviks who think that the industrial workers should rise up, modernize Russia, industrialize them, and establish communism. So the question you might be asking yourself right now is, what is communism? I'm so glad you asked. So the Bolsheviks were based on communism. And this is the belief that there should be no social classes, no property, and that government should own all of the means of production. So the means of production is this term that you're going to hear us use when we talk about economic systems, which basically means the ways that things are produced. So how they produce things, the means of production. Factories, machinery, profits, buildings, workers, wages, raw materials, anything that goes into making a good for the benefit of a country. In capitalism, factory owners, middle-class private citizens, or the bourgeoisie, as they were known to Karl Marx, should own the means of production. And that's what basically the rest of the industrialized world thrived on at that time, and still today. Socialism is the belief that factory workers and government should share in the means of production and share in those profits and those benefits to make the whole country stronger, but they're not going to completely outlaw personal property or say that everyone has to be exactly equal financially. Communism, however, says that the government should own the means of production, they should own all property, they should own everything. So they own your house, they own the hospital, they own the McDonald's, they own the shoe company down the street. And private citizens do not own any of that. And because the government owns everything, citizens own nothing. So if I own nothing and you own nothing, that makes us equal. Now, we know that in theory this sounds like a good idea, but in reality that still might not play out, because if we eliminate wealth, there are always going to be some factors, especially in kind of a strictly controlled environment, that allow some people to become more powerful than others. So the Bolsheviks are reading about this idea in the Communist Manifesto, which was written by Karl Marx. And this was really the first text where we see this idea of communism written about. And he says that the society will progress from capitalism to socialism to inevitably communism. And this will happen because the proletariat, or the working class, will grow and grow and grow, and will rise up out of their oppression of capitalism and overthrow the bourgeoisie, the middle class. So these terms, proletariat and bourgeoisie, are kind of recoined by Karl Marx. And bourgeoisie, you might remember, was also used as the middle class, kind of educated elite that were not landowners in the French Revolution. So he's kind of throwing it back to that same thing. And communism, once that happened, would be the pinnacle of society, so the top of the top, where everybody would be equal and share in the wealth of the community. Now, doesn't that sound lovely? Back to World War I. Not so lovely. So Tsar Nicholas hopes that this war is going to reunite Russia and stop this talk of the revolution. So he knows about the Bolsheviks, he knows about their ideas of communism, but he's super wealthy, so he's not going to give that up. And the people that support him are not going to give that up either. And so he knows these kind of it's kind of bubbling under the surface here. So he thinks 1914, we can throw our support behind Serbia and everybody rallying around this common enemy and stop this talk of revolution. You reunite the country. And he was right. So patriotism increases rapidly. People rush across the huge, massive Russia country to join the army. So that's where we ended up with 12 million troops. There were 6 million at the start of the war. And so already by July 1914, Russia already had 6 million soldiers lining up to go to war. However, Russia was not ready for war in other ways because they lacked mostly the industrialization, which would have given them factory and supplies, a transportation system, modern equipment, all of which would allow them to compete with industrialized countries such as Germany and Austria-Hungary. They also lacked competent military leaders. Because of this deficit, they did not fare well in the first battles of World War I on the Eastern Front. So they were very weak militarily, and they suffered devastating losses. Now, as the war progresses into 1915, conditions worsen. So by 1915, Tsar Nicholas II takes command of the Russian military, and he does this because he thinks, okay, if I'm going down with my ship. If Russia fails in World War I would also then look like a failure, so I have to do everything I can to make sure our military succeeds. However, Nicholas II was not qualified to lead an army. And because of this, conditions got even worse, and food and other goods grew scarce. So remember those peasants I talked about who were already kind of just scraping by, they were already now facing famine and food shortages and death and disease, and they are living a terrible life, while Nicholas's family is still living in that wonderful palace. So the peasants are growing very, very desperate for leadership, desperate for help, desperate for anything that would hopefully make their life better. So when Nicholas goes to war, Tsarina Alexandra, so the queen, is left in charge. And this was not a very popular move because she was not the rightful heir, nor was she a man. And so to kind of mitigate that, or to kind of make that better, Alexandra was taking advice from one of Nicholas II's advisors known as Grigory Rasputin. And Rasputin is this crazy guy over here, and he was very corrupt and immoral. So this was also not going very well. So, by March 8th, 1917, things are kind of the pits. And in Petrograd, which was formerly and now known as St. Petersburg, which was the capital of the time, unhappy citizens begin to march on the capital. And the police and the soldiers were lower class citizens. They did not own land. They were sympathetic to the citizens' cause, the peasant cause, or the revolutionary cause. And so they were not going to stop these citizens from marching up on this capital. The Duma, that legislative body, was also suffering because Tsar Nicholas II was at war. They were kind of left without instruction. They were kind of in conflict with Nicholas II, and so they defied Nicholas II, and they supported these rebels as well. So within 1 week, on March 15th, 1917, Nicholas II is forced to abdicate, and the revolution truly begins in earnest. Abdicate means give up the throne. So he's forced to step down from being Tsar. Now they are left with no Tsar in Russia. So the Duma establishes a temporary or provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky. This government wanted to continue fighting against the Central Powers, and partly because of that, but also because they saw that the leader was a little too free, a little too liberal, many Russians didn't like this government. They were looking for somebody to persevere and control and conquer them and lead them to progress. And they also wanted out of the war. So they were not very supportive in general of the Duma. So Lenin was still the leader of that group called the Bolsheviks, and he wanted basic changes to this Duma provisional government. He said, that's all I want. I just want to advocate for my group. So by mid-1917, later that year, Kerensky's government is still fighting the Central Powers in World War I. Lenin wanted to end this involvement, And the Russian army was totally weak, so it just basically collapsed in on itself. So the Kerensky Duma provisional government is not really working out so hot. Lenin, in return, is also gaining strength and power. So by November of 1917, the Bolshevik Red Guard, which is a militia made up of factory workers, attacked Kerensky's government. So this is one of those buildings that I showed you before. It was a government building, it was not a palace at that time. But so the Red Guard literally charges on their legislative body. And the legislators, not surprisingly, did not put up much of a fight. So they basically said, okay, it's all yours, Lenin. And Lenin establishes a radical communist program. He makes private ownership of anything illegal, so nothing is yours. And he takes the land and he redistributes those peasants. So basically he says to all the private owners of that land, all the middle-class bourgeoisie citizens, you no longer own this massive plot of land. I'm going to take it and I'm going to give it to the people that work for you because they deserve it and you do not. So you are now out of your house. So the peasants now have kind of the control over this land. They don't really own it because it's owned by the government. But the people that did nothing but sit in their manor house and watch people farm for them really have nothing left to stand for. So another part of this is that Lenin, remember, wanted to end involvement in the war. So Leon Trotsky, his friend, was sent to negotiate with the Central Powers. And because they were losing so terribly and they just wanted out of the war at all costs, Russia lost much of their land to the Central Powers because of the lack of their strong military. So that Eastern Front we looked at before, this was all Russia. Now it is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. So this is why we have this little pocket of East Russia over here that eventually gets taken back into Russia, and today it's part of the Russian Federation. But Poland becomes its own country. A lot of these other Eastern European countries get broken up with World War I, as well. But now we have independent countries carved out of Russia. Remember, St. Petersburg is right up here in this little nook. So some Russians, because of this, the massive loss of land, disliked the negotiations and their results. So they form what is called the White Army to oppose the Red Guard. So this White Army was made up of army leaders, political opponents, and other wealthy Russians who were now disadvantaged because of the reforms of the Bolshevik Revolution. France and the United States support this White Army. Remember, France and the United States are capitalist, industrialized countries. They want to support the calm, capitalist side of things versus the radical, strange, scary, new communist side of things. So they fight for a few years, and the fighting and the famine that it caused cost millions of lives. By late 1920, the Bolsheviks emerge as the winners, and they not only established communism, but also introduced this new economic policy, which is a plan that incorporates some capitalist activity. So by 1922, the economy began to improve, and Russia reunited with some of the neighboring lands. So Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, those other smaller countries. Poland is still separate, and that's important. But those other little tiny countries, they are still republics, but they're almost like states. So they get reabsorbed into the Russian Empire. And instead of it being the Russian Empire, it is now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. So from here on out, we are calling Russia either the USSR or the Soviet Union because of this revolution. So they are a communist country, but remember, the Bolsheviks were not supported by France and the US. So France, US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the former Allied powers, now have a little bit of tension politically after World War I and after the Bolshevik Revolution.